All right, welcome. Today we have with us, it's a pleasure to have with us Dr. Kirk Parsley, who's down there in Texas. Kirk, just for those people that aren't familiar, just share your background. I know you're Navy SEAL, you're a performance medicine guy, but
yeah. So I was a SEAL right out of high school. I went to UT, so you might know Katy, Texas, when it was a small rice farming town. I grew up in Texas.
just west of Houston, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So joined actually at 17, left right after my 18th birthday. Didn't even know what a SEAL was, but I just heard it was like the toughest training in the world. So I wanted to go do that. I figured I'll do that. It's always time. So it's 2 for 1. They train you 4 years in medical school. You got to give them 8 years as a doctor. I figured I'd get back to the SEAL teams and get back to the community. And my whole plan was to be an orthopedic surgeon. And I'd done my first year residency, and then Navy, you have to do your first year, and then you go out to the fleet, as they call it, and then you come back. That's how they keep GPs. And so I figured I'd go back to the SEAL teams, give something back to the community. I got there right when they were building their first sports medicine facility ever. So I got put in charge of that. That's pretty, logical fit. So the entire purpose of me going to sleep tonight is to repair from today, right? Everything I'm doing right now is catabolic. Like just being awake is being catabolic. When I work out, I'm damaging my muscles, right? If we do anything worth doing when we go to the gym, we come out of the gym weaker than we went into the gym. We get stronger at night. So I'm gonna repair everything, and then I'm gonna prepare, meaning I'm gonna restock the shelves of all the nutrient densities or whatever, trace elements, whatever I need to do to put around my cells, replenishing glycogen stores, all that stuff. So when I first go to sleep, deep sleep is kind of the first thing that I'm going to go into, as long as I'm circadianly aligned. And so I'm going to go to sleep in what we call stage 1 sleep, which is that's when you're just noticing that things aren't quite the same. You can still hear people, but it's drifting in and out of dream state. And then I go down to 2, and then 3, and then 4. Stages 3 and 4 are what we call deep sleep, omega or theta and delta wave brain states. And then that travels across time on the x-axis. And then I'm going to stair step out of that. I'm going to go from 4 to 3 to 2. Past 1 and back. I'm going to do REM. And then after I finish REM, I'm going to come back down. And that's one sleep cycle, which is about 90 to 120 minutes. The first sleep cycle is about 90% deep sleep. And deep sleep is the most anabolic time in your life. The lowest stress hormones you will ever have. So stress hormones are catabolic, obviously. The lowest stress hormones you will ever have at any 24-hour period is during deep sleep. Your stress hormones have to be low enough for you to sleep. And then what's happening there is the neuroregulation of all of your hormones. So all of your anabolic hormones are being measured by the hypothalamus, and then the pituitary is secreting or not secreting to increase all of your hormones. And that's affecting, obviously, things like testosterone and growth hormone, and thyroid hormone. But it's also affecting neuroregulation of appetite, ghrelin, leptin sensitivity. And then I'm essentially repairing everything during the same time. One of the first things that happens when I go to sleep is the glial cell, which hold the structure of the brain, they contract by about 30%, allows the CSF to flow through. People call this the glymphatic system, and it flushes out waste products. I flush out the waste products, I increase my hormones. The hormones then reset the anabolic rate, increase the anabolic rate. Thyroid comes up, that increases anabolic rate. And I'm the most anabolic I'll ever be. And I start repairing things. I start getting rid of waste products and repairing. And then I go into REM sleep. And REM sleep is really more cognitive and emotional. So during REM sleep, you will rehearse everything that you've heard today, everything you've thought today, probably, definitely everything you've said. You'll run that through your brain a couple of times, and you'll figure out whether you need it or not. And it'll either become a more durable pathway and be attached to old information, which is how you learn things, right? You can look at it from multi-dimensions if you have attachments from old information, or it'll be pruned off because you'll determine it's useless, and you'll actually prune that neuron off. And then you also emotionally categorize your events. So we think this is a big component of PTSD, because it tends to be when people go through severe trauma, they tend to sleep poorly. And one of the things that we know happens during REM sleep is the emotional categorization of any event. So if you have a fight with your wife about dirty dishes in the sink or something, that should be a non-issue, right? Like the second that argument's over, you should probably never think about that again, right? But if you don't sleep well that night, or if you don't sleep at all that night, you don't emotionally categorize that correctly, that could become a real trigger. And that's a banal example, but that's what we think happens with PTSD, and why people are more triggered by emotional events that rightfully are emotional, but they're hyper emotional, they're exceedingly emotional. And And then each sleep cycle progresses throughout the night, becomes more REM and deep sleep and less deep. So then by the time you get to the morning, it's about 90% REM sleep in your last sleep cycle and 10% deep. So when you miss sleep in the beginning of the night, you tend to miss the anabolic period of your life of that day. And then when you wake up super early and skip your REM, then that's cognitive and emotional. And it's worth pointing out that if I could go to sleep tonight and I could repair 100% and then prepare, so restock the shelves to get all my nutrients in order to rebalance everything. If I could repair and prepare 100%, I would wake up exactly the same every day, right? And I would never age. As we get older, we can't repair 100% and we can't prepare 100%. And so we're waking up at maybe 99.998 or something, and that's aging. So when you choose to sleep, everybody's born into the same contract. It takes 8 hours to recover from being awake for 16 hours, right? It's a ballpark, right? It's biology. Don't get super technical about that. 8 hours for 16 hours. If you choose to sleep 6 hours instead of 8 hours, tomorrow still comes at exactly the same time, and you still have to do all the exact same things. So your body compensates by secreting more stress hormones, because the whole purpose of stress hormones is to keep you alert in proportion to your environment, right? So stress hormones get a bad name. Oh, I don't want any stress hormones. With no stress hormones, you'd be dead. So what you want is appropriate level of stress hormones. But if you short sleep or get poor quality of sleep, then you're going to wake up in the morning with excessive stress hormones. And it's quite possible you'll have excessive stress hormones the whole day. And then you have a hard time falling asleep because your stress hormones are too high. And then you don't sleep well because you had a hard time falling asleep. And now you can't sleep well because your stress hormones are high, and your stress hormones keep going higher because you aren't sleeping well. That's the most common type of insomnia that I work with. Yeah, you're spot on with that. And it makes logical sense from what I said. If the whole reason I'm sleeping tonight is to repair and prepare, if I didn't burn much down, if I didn't do much that I need to repair from or restock the shelves from or whatever, like I don't need as much sleep. And you're right on, about 7 hours and 15 minutes, somewhere around there is like the minimum effective dose of sleep for 99.9% of the population. But you're right. If I went out and ran an ultra marathon, assuming I could, I don't think, but if I went out and ran a marathon, let's say that, if I ran a marathon today, I'd probably need like 12 hours of sleep tonight. So if you're really overtaxing yourself, and that can be cognitive, that can be emotional, that can be physical, but anything that's like really ramping up your stress hormones and really depleting your stores and inflaming you, especially, the most powerful anti-inflammatory we have in our body is testosterone, and the peak testosterone production, 98% of all the testosterone you produce in 24 hours is during deep sleep, right? And so that's when you're really repairing. So if you're going to be anabolic, the more catabolic you were during the day, the more time you need for the anabolic behavior. The correlation the other way is actually more powerful. As far as your macros, when you're eating your macros, that's really, no, it'll be no surprise to you. That's really dependent upon your metabolic state to begin with, right? If you have insulin sensitivity issues, right? If you're somebody who has a fasting insulin of 45 or something like that, eating carbs before bed is going to be really bad for you, because if you eat carbs close to bedtime, like I'm sure you've probably seen clinically that people who are pre-diabetic, pre-peri-diabetic, or even diabetics who don't control their blood glucose well, they don't sleep very well. And that's because your brain will wake you up with a rapid decrease in blood glucose. And it doesn't matter what it's going from. It could be going from 400 to 300, right? Still ridiculously high. But that sudden decrease will trigger your brain. And the theory behind that is that it's probably like every other mammal on the planet, right? The only time any mammal on the planet sleep deprives themselves is if they're starving to death, or if they're being preyed upon, right? If they're being stalked. So it's reasonable to believe that we probably have some evolutionary trigger in our brain that says, hey, blood glucose is going down really quickly. We're either in a really stressful state where we've dumped all of our glycogen and now that's crashing, or we're starving to death. So that will cause an animal to wake up earlier, faster, and it does the same to humans. So it leads to an adrenal response when you get this quick dip in blood glucose. So if you have insulin sensitivity issues and you eat carbs in your bed, there's a good chance you drop fast enough. And like I said, the total doesn't match just the rate of decline. Now, what's more impressive though is the fuel partitioning the next day, right? So if you don't sleep well and you're catabolic, your stress hormones are really high, right? And cortisol, of course, is increasing the breakdown of glycogen so it's favoring not storing glucose, right? And so you're favoring storage of fat and not storing glucose. So your fuel partitioning changes. You can have the same macros. But then, like I said earlier, also the leptin and ghrelin sensitivity to the brain is readjusted every night. So every night that you don't get good sleep, you could wake up the next day with not only bad, unfavorable fuel partitioning, but also a higher appetite, right? And a higher craving, because of the combination of those two, a higher craving for fats and glucose, right? If I'm starving to death, if I'm going into famine, my brain wants glucose. And then my body wants to store as much fat as I possibly can because maybe I'm going into famine. And so I'm going to crave sugar and I'm going to crave fat. And I think that's where the donut comes from, right? It's like we're going to fry up some sugar bread and get lots of fat in there and so forth. Yeah, the correlation goes both ways. And the same is true for sleep and everything else, sleep and exercise and sleep and stress mitigation throughout the day. Everything's negatively impacted by sleep, and then poor lifestyle, or lack of sleep, I should say, and then poor lifestyle choices impact your ability to sleep. So our ancestors, the only light they truly had was the sunlight and a little bit of fire, right? At nighttime could be light. And so we have some ganglia in the back of our eyes that have nothing to do with vision. They just sense blue light. So that's why a lot of blind people can have normal circadian rhythms for this reason. And once the blue light goes down, as you said, that triggers through this circuitous pathway going through the SCN, and then the pineal gland secretes melatonin. Melatonin secretes GABA, like I was saying. The GABA then causes GABA increase, and then GABA slows down the neocortex. And that leads to a whole cascade that takes 2 to 3 hours to work before we really feel sleepy. But the things that happen with the circadian alignment is the secretion of melatonin in a predictable schedule, the secretion of GABA in a predictable schedule, the timing of the neocortex slowing down, and then our body temperature drops because we didn't have HVAC, right? The secretion of GABA, like I said, leads to the slowing down of the neocortex. If you can excite yourself past that, right? If you've ever been so tired, you wake up in the morning, I'm just going to go to work and come home and go to sleep. And then your friend talks you into going to happy hour, you drink some CNS depressants, and all of a sudden you're stimulated and you're wide awake, right? Because you've just overcome that GABA effect anyway. So the circadian alignment is super important, because people think that when we shift our circadian rhythm, we're shifting all the circadian rhythm of all of our cells. That's not true. So every cell has a biological clock, right? Every cell has a circadian rhythm. It's doing different things at night. It's doing different things at sleep time. It's doing during wake time. And so we can entrain ourselves to go to sleep in alignment with the rest of our cells, or we work night shift and we keep our brains awake when our cells are saying, no, we're doing sleep stuff. And I think that's where that mismatch is what causes the damage and the shortened life expectancy and all that. So the circadian rhythm is one important part to make us go to sleep. That, of course, if you're aligning with the sun, that's going to be very consistent. So consistency matters a whole lot with that. The other thing that matters a lot is what we call sleep pressure. And that's just adenosine, right? So ATP to ADP, AMP, and just A. And that A is like telling our brains, hey, man, we've burned it down. Like, it's time to go to sleep. Like, we need to rest. So men tend to be more muscular than women. Men build up sleep pressure a lot better than women. Men usually go to sleep even when they're stressed out. They crash. They do one sleep cycle and then they wake up because their stress hormones are high. But we need the adenosine for the sleep pressure. That's one thing that's driving us to sleep. And then the circadian alignment is the other thing that's driving us to sleep. And then the sleep environment, of course, is allowing us to maintain sleep.
Discuss it, because I know there's always fights between men and women about how cold they want the bedroom, and what does science say is the best sleeping temperature?
The primary difference there is body mass, and so women are just cooling off faster than men. The core temperature going down about 1 degree Celsius, so about roughly 2 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a pretty big drop in core temperature. If you've ever, like when I was a SEAL and we dove in cold water a lot, they're super worried about a core temperature that went down 3 degrees. That was hypothermia, and you could affect your rate. So it's actually a pretty big decrease. And what they found research wise is it's somewhere around 64 degrees Fahrenheit that people tend to sleep well. Of course, that can vary depending on like how spongy your mattress is, because that holds heat in, how many covers you have on you and things like that. But that seems to be 64, 66 degrees seems to be the sweet zone in the research. So I went to like really conventional conservative databases like Cochrane database, right? And whatever, Google Scholar and this PubMed and things like that. And I just looked up what supplements have been proven to affect sleep. And then once you learn enough about sleep, you go, okay, there's actually nothing surprising about that, right? So like I said, you have that initial trigger of melatonin, which is like the starter pistol that starts this cascade of hundreds of neurotransmitter changes throughout your brain, throughout different regions of your brain, throughout the night, everything's cycling around. So it's a really complex mess, what all melatonin changes. But like I said, one of the first changes is this big increase in GABA, slowing down the neocortex, right? And so all I put in my supplement, which is what was proven to work by the databases, right? It was like everything that helps you produce melatonin, right? So tryptophan becomes 5-hydroxytryptophan. Mm-hmm. You need magnesium and vitamin D3 as cofactors to turn 5-HTP into serotonin. Serotonin becomes melatonin. Then we needed GABA. GABA doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier super well, so you take L-theanine, which enhances the efficacy of GABA, what does cross into the brain. And that was pretty much it. Later on, I figured out, you've probably seen the research for like lactate threshold and VO2 max and so forth, that phosphatidylserine can enhance that because it lowers cortisol and norepinephrine, stress hormones. So cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine. And so I added that because so many people have sleep problems. A lot of people, research will show that people will have an increased subjective increase in sleep quality and duration when they use THC. However, tachyphylaxis is super quick with that. So you end up on about 10 times as much THC in 30 days than what you started with. But objectively, if you do a polysomnograph on them, their quality of sleep goes down significantly. The CBDs do actually seem to be somewhat promising, and that they can both enhance duration and quality, and you don't seem to accommodate to them nearly as quickly. So you can, and I think one's called CBD2. I don't know a whole lot about those, but it's called a CBD2, CBD2 and CBDN. I don't know what the N stands for, honestly, but those have both been shown to improve both subjective and objective quality of sleep. But it's not huge. It's 10%, 20%, something along those lines. And then as far as the things that you can do to improve your ability to go to sleep, what we touched on earlier, and actually you asked earlier and I forgot to say, part of that consistency of going to sleep at the same time to get the highest quality is also dependent upon the activities that you're doing during the day being somewhat consistent. If I work out right before bed, if I work out 2 hours before bed and I just really go in there and hit it hard, I'm spiking my stress hormones hugely to get to that workout. I'm going to have a harder time going to sleep versus, and that's actually, to answer your question, that's actually one of the tools we can use for jet lag. If I'm going somewhere where bedtime is going to come before I want it to come, I can work out late in the day. I can put bright lights in my eyes late in the day. And I can actually stimulate my adrenals to raise my stress hormones to push my bedtime further away from me. And like I said, you can do about half an hour to an hour a day. If you're going across 6 time zones for 2 days, you're going to be screwed up the whole time. In fact, you're probably better just staying on your other time zone, your home time zone if you can, because you can only adjust about 1 time zone a day. And that's at best. But you adjust it by, if I put bright lights and exercise early in my day, I bring bedtime closer. If I do it later in the day, I push bedtime away from me. And those are really the only 2 things we have.